Hello, and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Joe Olson. I'm the Communications and Engagement Director here at Fresh Energy and also your host for today. I'm excited to be joined by Fresh Energy's Executive Director, Michael Noble, our Senior Director of Science Policy, Jay Drake Hamilton, and Fresh Energy Board Member, Jim Ladner. Welcome, everyone.
Hello,
Hi, Joe.
everyone.
Great to be here.
Thanks, guys. Well, we're here today because Fresh Energy is celebrating 30 years of making history for clean energy and climate here in Minnesota and the Midwest.
Wow.
Now, it's a long time, isn't it? So when I started thinking about this podcast and how we'd tackle 30 years of history, I was, of course, instantly overwhelmed. I didn't want our conversation to turn into a laundry list of accomplishments, which, to be fair, there are many, but we have an entire webpage dedicated to that. And folks who want to check out a list year by year can go to fresh-energy.org/history. So instead, I thought I would bring Michael, Jim, and Jay in to talk about some pivotal moments in each decade of Fresh Energy's history. And by pivotal moments, I mean moments where a decision was made that shaped the organization's trajectory, a crossroads, if you will. But first, let's do introductions. Michael, why don't you start?
Sure, Joe. I'm Michael Noble, and I am the Executive Director of Fresh Energy. I've been the Executive Director of Fresh Energy since I think it was the fall of 1995. But prior to that, I was very, very involved in the origins of Fresh Energy a few years earlier than that. So I've been honored and fortunate to be the executive leader now for 27 years.
Thank you, Michael. Jay, would you go next?
Hi, I'm Jay Drake Hamilton. I'm the Senior Director of Science Policy at Fresh Energy. I came to work here when I deliberately decided to leave my academic career that I loved because I wanted to enact climate policy. I was following technology changes and media in Minnesota, and I saw the opportunity to move energy and climate policy forward dramatically. Little did I know the clean energy transformation we were on the cusp of creating. I was the second employee, and I started in December 1995. But Michael was the leader who convinced me the power of building long-term relationships.
Thank you, Jay. And Jim, your turn.
Well, thanks, Joe. I recently rejoined the Fresh Energy Board. I was on the board initially and involved in helping to form the organization back in the early 1990s. And then I left the board and the organization for a few decades while I worked as a lawyer in a number of different medical device companies in Minnesota. But it's wonderful to be able to kind of call back those early days in really in the fall of 1990s where it all started. And then a couple of years later, we actually, with Michael and others, we filed the articles of incorporation and things started off. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that today.
Thank you. And thank you all. I'm really excited for our conversation. So let's start with the first decade of Fresh Energy. Now, Michael, when we were first brainstorming this podcast, you mentioned that in the first decade of Fresh Energy's history, we had a coalition mindset. So I think that's the exact word you used, actually. And this coalition mindset shaped how decisions were made at Fresh Energy. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, sure. At the conference in the fall of 1990, where we decided to form an organization, I think there might have been 60 people there. But a quarter of them were from academia and scholars. A quarter of them were grassroots environmental committed activists, energy activists. A quarter of them maybe were from state government, but a quarter of them were the executive directors of a variety of nonprofit organizations who saw some connection to energy in their mission and their purpose. And it was really those nonprofit executive directors who began meeting regularly, weekly, month after month after month, that coalition mindset, as you say, that the founding of Fresh Energy was all of those groups working together to get it off the ground. So I always say that coalitions and partnerships and playing nice in the sandbox, that's built into our DNA. That's who we were from the very first day.
Well, and I have to just follow up on Michael's statements about the way things work to begin with. There were lots of different opinions, lots of different thoughts about the way to try to get at the issues, how to take action. And I mean, the fact that there were differing ideas and thoughts on how to move forward was important, because it helped make the group stronger. It wasn't always easy though, and sometimes we had some challenges, but it really was a coalition, and we really built on that as things continued, and I think that'll become evident through this discussion, and certainly has been over the years. There were other things too that were key at the end, at the beginning. Certainly the fact that we focused on energy efficiency and economics, I think was really set the coalition apart from many others. Mike, you might have some thoughts about that. I certainly do.
Yeah, and I think economics are next. So the coalition mindset definitely comes through in our work today, 3 decades later. But now, Jim, as you said, let's turn to the word economy and the economics of clean energy. In the first decade of Fresh Energy's work, the economic case for clean energy had a really big role to play in the organization's public communications and in our policies. Michael, do you have some thoughts there?
Well, sure. I promised myself I wasn't going to say the first name of the organization that we lived with for 16 years, but the word economics and economy was in the name. And that was one way we distinguished ourselves from environmental organizations, is we were an energy policy group that wanted all of our solutions to be economic, to be businesses that could scale up, that could make their way in the marketplace. So having clean energy solutions, having energy efficiency solutions, having climate solutions be market-based and fit in with a market economy, that too was built into the DNA of our brand and our the way we positioned ourselves. And there were so many important players and voices, but when you have a coalition partnership and when you have a friend, an activist like George Crocker on one end of the spectrum, and you have a friend, an activist like Sheldon Strom on both ends of the spectrum, who both agree that we have to transform our economy, that's the making of an interesting, powerful coalition.
Well, exactly. And I mean, that's the kind of thing pushing on. We were able to get our arms around the idea that economics really made a difference to people. And we focused on early on the fact that the state of Minnesota had spent $6 billion on energy, but 98% of it was coming from out of state. That's an economic issue. It was affecting businesses. It was affecting people's pocketbooks. And so that was really a key principle that I think the group rallied around, and we focused on, and whether it was in our conferences, whether it was our discussions with legislatures or other policymakers, and that continued, I think, over the years, which is really why the group's, I think, been largely so successful.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm sure, Michael, now you've sent people spelunking into the depths of the internet to find the original organization's name, but maybe we'll share it at the end just for fun. Now, go ahead, Michael.
To follow up a little bit, in that very, very first year, it was even the year before we were incorporated, we were very involved at the state legislature in helping to put together an Omnibus Energy Act of 1991. And in that same year, the year before we were incorporated, we put on a major conference with hundreds of people. The title of the conference was The Environmental Costs of Energy Decisions. So we were tying the environment and the economy together as part of a story, a narrative, a public policy agenda before we were even over at the Secretary of State filing the Articles of Incorporation. We were already on message that it's about the environment and about the economy and about people and inclusion. So it's been a through line through our entire history that the organization we are today was set in the fall of 1990 at that conference.
Well, and I think that pivots really well to the final major decision of the third decade. Again, there were many big decisions, but the three we decided to focus on today. So the third one was shaping and balancing ambition, urgency, expertise, and science. So from what I've heard, these four things together were the key ingredients in the fresh energy recipe. Michael, can you talk about the perspectives and voices that were in play at Fresh Energy at this time?
Well, again, in this first decade, I already mentioned that we were coalition, so we were representing, 15 or 20, maybe a dozen hardcore collaborators who were partnering together. Each one had their own organizational imperatives. Each one had their own management and boards. And the purpose of the coalition was try to move as a state, like together on this clean energy vision. And one thing that was really baked in at the beginning was ambition. There virtually was zero wind energy in Minnesota in 1995, with the exception of a very small number of old Danish wind turbines that had been rewound by an entrepreneur, small 40 kilowatt turbines out on the landscape. There was no commercial wind energy. There was only the very few wealthy people had solar energy on their home. It was very uncommon. And we had an early ambition that we would have 1,000 megawatts, which at the time was over $1 billion, maybe closer to $2 billion at that time, I suppose. We'd have 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy by the year 2000. And well, we didn't get it all built. I think at the end of 2000, the end of that first decade, we had about 975 megawatts that were planned or approved or ordered or legislated or guaranteed. So we came within a whisker of reaching that original ambitious goal of 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy when we started with zero. I like to show a photograph in our office. I say, you know what that wind farm is? People say, what is that? I say, that's the first commercial wind farm built between California and Denmark. And this organization advocated for that to be built. And we were on the podium at the ribbon cutting, the first commercial wind farm between California and Denmark.
Thanks, Michael. Jim, do you want to chime in here? I know you were part of the organization at that time.
Well, I think, again, as Michael said, there was a focus on science, and that was unusual as well. I think, the Department of Public Service in Minnesota had done a number of studies in the 80s that really weren't receiving the attention that they deserved. But they found that 52% of the electricity in the state could be used or could be avoided by using energy efficiency measures. They also found that there was a tremendous potential for wind power. And so I think the organization, the coalition, really started promoting studies like that, and that continued as things moved along, even in that first decade. And so it's that emphasis on science as well as the economy that really, I think, was made for the organization to be successful.
Well, and I think the key word here is science, and we can't say science without Jay just absolutely lighting up, because that is her bread and butter. So Jay, you are the first climate scientist on Fresh Energy's staff. Would you describe how you used your perspective and voice to shape Fresh Energy in that first decade?
Joe, I used my academic background as a climate scientist and brought bringing climate into the public conversation. I helped normalize the fact that climate is a serious problem. In 1997, I wrote and published a report called Playing with Fire, which discussed how global warming would damage industries that are icons in Minnesota. Think of forestry, fishing, tourism, snow recreation, ice fishing, agriculture, and more. And for many folks, Fresh Energy's communications were the first time they'd heard this. I sat down to interview the best climate scientists in Minnesota, many of them Regents professors at the U, and convinced them all to let me tell their stories. Playing with fire became our calling card for getting me in front of audiences all across Minnesota, including the Minnesota legislature. Our publication went on to 3 total editions, 1997, 2000, and 2002, all widely acclaimed. Fresh Energy became viewed as climate experts who were driving attention to the urgency of addressing climate change.
Well, and Jay, you were certainly Fresh Energy's first climate scientist, but I think also the original climate storyteller at Fresh Energy, and we're grateful that you're still here playing that role. So now to recap, the 3 pivotal moments for Fresh Energy in the first decade are: number 1, the coalition mindset; 2, the economic case for clean energy and energy efficiency; and 3, balancing of ambition, urgency, expertise, and science with voices from across the spectrum. And with that, I think we're ready to move into decade 2. So as an employee of Fresh Energy for nearly 3 whole years now, I can say that I can see how all of these early decisions play out in our work even today. So as we move into decade 2, or what I'm going to call the decade of Jay, and I'm saying that lightly, Jay, but really you brought the urgent need for climate action throughout all of Minnesota. So maybe you can kick us off and talk a little bit about how you got the conversation, the climate conversation, going in all 87 of Minnesota's counties.
Thank you, Joe. Because I come from a science background, the data were very clear to me. But I determined my role was to help Minnesotans and our state and regional leaders understand that climate change is real and happening right before our eyes, and to give them effective action steps that will help solve the crisis. I started working with Will Steger, our beloved and outspoken Minnesota conservationist, an Arctic and Antarctic explorer. And we hit the road and visited more than 60 Minnesota cities and talked to upwards of 100,000 people about the impacts of climate change in Minnesota. At that time, I gave Will Steger the nickname of the eyewitness to global warming. Right from our first climate show on the road, I knew we could attract audiences of over 1,000 people at a time. I recognized the size of audience, and running events everywhere in Minnesota, I witnessed our potential power. I also grew the vision to have us introduced at the events by the city's mayor and major businesses in the universities and utilities were in the room, as well as faith leaders up to bishops, entire families, and the whole city council. The events were all covered by newspaper, radio, and TV media. But note, at every public forum, I asked the audience of people to sign a postcard addressed to their elected state or federal leaders with a specific ask for energy and climate action. Get this, routinely, over 75% of our audience signed the postcards for action, and I delivered them directly to their leaders' offices.
And I'll admit, Jay, that's a thing that was put into the Fresh Energy Communications playbook that we are still using today, both printed postcard and virtual. So, Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about Jay's role in the climate conversation that Fresh Energy was leading?
Yeah, when the history books are written, there has to be a chapter about J. Drake Hamilton. She's a giant at Fresh Energy and a giant in my life. But she was the original gangster, the original climate activist, the first one to tell the story. And we used to joke, no offense to anybody who lives in Powderhorn Park, but we're not sending J. Drake Hamilton to Powderhorn Park because she's too busy talking in Fergus Falls or Crookston or Mankato or Worthington. And the year 2006, I believe J. Drake Hamilton and Will Steger talked to over 17,000 Minnesotans. And imagine, this maybe isn't exactly correct, but it's close enough. Imagine at the theater in Crookston, the banner on the theater says, Will Steger, eyewitness to global warming, Saturday night with J. Drake Hamilton from Fresh Energy. And I still to this day maintain that's why in 2007, the Next Generation Energy Act passed and the Renewable Energy Standard passed and the ban on constructing new coal-fired power plants passed, is because Jay, in her miraculous contributions to the public debate, she figured out how to get everybody in Minnesota to rally around a vision that we could cut emissions and help the economy. And I just always thank Jay and Will Steger for partnering up that year. They had a lot of nights on the road to talk to 17,000 people in 2006. And it was the fundamental reason why all the rural legislators joined the suburban legislators, joined the urban legislators. And when those two bills passed, the Next Generation Energy Act and the Renewable Energy Standard passed in the spring of 2007, 192 legislators out of 201 sitting legislators voted yes.
Absolutely. And I think so that actually introduces us to the next pivotal moment in Fresh Energy's second decade. So as we were just discussing, Fresh Energy pushed Minnesota to begin leading from the middle of the country. And this, I think, and obviously you do too, Michael, is thanks in part to Jay and Will Steger's work. So in addition to that, Minnesota was showing other states what was possible by accomplishing some major legislative wins for clean energy, energy efficiency, and more, as you alluded to, Michael. Jay, can you remind us a little bit about the political climate in 2007 if we were to hop back in our time machines? How did Minnesota end up setting the pace for all other Midwest states?
Absolutely, Joe. At the Minnesota legislature, both Democrats and Republicans came together in climate action, passing the Next Generation Energy Act in 2007. Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty led the way, and folks from both sides of the aisle played a major role. I especially want to mention that at that time, Senator Ellen Anderson and Senator Yvonne Pretner-Solon played very major roles. But the victory was not just in energy. The Next Generation Energy Act included provisions to cut greenhouse gas emissions across our entire economy, dramatically cut carbon pollution in every sector by at least 80% by 2050. And that's what got the country's attention.
Thanks, Jay. Michael, do you want to tag on to this a little bit? I know 2007 was a big year.
You know, I always say that Fresh Energy had major accomplishments in every year from 1990 on. And you already mentioned earlier, you can go to our website, freshenergy.org/history, to see actually what the accomplishments were in every single year. But I refer to 2007 as the year we ran the table. There were no balls left on the billiard table because we dropped them all in the pockets. Every law that we introduced became law. And the majority leader in the Minnesota Senate at that time had been the majority leader for 22 years, Roger Moe. And he once mentioned to me at an event, he said, you know, energy was never a top tier issue in the entire 22 years. And here we have a third tier issue that, wow, about halfway through the session, I could see that's a second tier issue. Oh my God, now that's a first tier issue. And then your issue was the only issue we accomplished major things in 2007, and you won everything you proposed. You know, Fresh Energy and the allies and the many groups. And again, Senator Anderson, and too many to mention, Speaker of the House, Margaret Anderson Kelleher was a giant, but there's too many friends to mention. We basically set the agenda for energy and climate that we are still implementing today. we're no longer the most ambitious state. Just last night, Maryland passed a law. Their entire economy will be carbon free by 2045. We haven't passed anything like that. So I'm not feeling big for my britches here on our accomplishments. We have a lot more to accomplish, but in 2007, we were the national leader, that's for sure.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Michael. So that brings us to another pivotal moment in decade 2 of Fresh Energy's history. The Fresh Energy Coalition model actually ended up becoming a national model, and other states took notice. Michael, can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, we talked about that, having all the groups at the table, and we had a small family foundation in Massachusetts that noticed that Fresh Energy was getting a lot done because everybody was playing nice in the sandbox. And from 2004 to 2014, we built a network. We helped to build a network of 150 organizations in 8 states, and we studied the problem that we had, and the problem we described as nonprofit advocacy groups trying to change the business model for the electric utilities. We studied that problem very, very, very deeply. And we realized that there were 4 most important levers that we had to figure out how to move. And all these 150 groups agreed on that in 2004. And one was that we had to massively ramp up our energy efficiency commitments by a factor of 50 or more. And we had to massively ramp up our renewable energy commitments by a factor of 50 or more. And we finally had to admit to each other that a new coal plant could never, ever be built again. And we had one more agreement that it was almost like a secret agreement because people were afraid to say it out loud. And that's that ultimately every operating coal plant in America had to be taken down. And J. Drake Hamilton in 2004 took on the leadership at Fresh Energy to tackle all the coal plants. And I'm proud to say today that 16 coal plants that were operating in 2004, we have closing dates on 15 out of 16 of them. And we're going to get the last one in the next year or two. So every single coal plant now has a contractual legal obligation to retire, in the next few years. And that strategy was set nationwide, really, out of a collaboration that Fresh Energy helped to organize. That the conference that made those commitments happened in Racine, Wisconsin in 2004. And one of the huge things that spawned out of that was the National Sierra Club Beyond Coal campaign. And they claim now that more than half of America's coal plants have closing dates, in addition to the 15 out of 16 coal plants in Minnesota.
And Michael, you'll remember that back in 2004, closing coal was so radical, most organizations didn't even want to mention it in their communications.
Yeah.
So we started with the fact that the biggest coal plant in Minnesota, the Sherco plant, is the largest soot and carbon polluter in our state. We told that to audiences. It is also one of EPA's watch list as one of the top emitters of mercury and sulfur dioxide in the nation. At this time, I really ramped up my close work with Minnesota's utilities on these issues. They were on our radar screen. I worked with Exxon, Xcel, Great River Energy, Otter Tail Power, and Simpa. I regularly had offices in Denver, for example, 500 of the best customers of Xcel Energy. They brought them to the room, and I had 1 hour on the agenda to tell them what we needed to do about climate change. I led our partners in big public forums to collect take action signatures from Minnesotans whose utilities owned coal-fired power plants. One of our first asks was to comment on the regulatory authority of the Minnesota's Public Utilities Commission and ask them to require Xcel Energy to plan to replace the oldest 2 units of its biggest coal plants, Sherco 1 and 2, and replace them with clean energy, wind, solar, and energy efficiency. We knew we needed to outcompete electric companies at the PUC using the same tools that they used. We needed the ability to run the same expensive computer models utilities used. We raised the money to get access to those models, and we started using them to demonstrate to regulators that there was a cheaper, more reliable option than keeping investing in fossil fuels. Fresh Energy and our partners made the case using the computer model to put data into the PUC's record that showed clean energy was reliable and affordable. It was a huge win.
Thank you, Jay. So, for those taking notes, 3 of the pivotal moments for Fresh Energy in Decade 2 are: number 1, talking about climate change as a serious problem. Number 2, leading from the middle of the country. And number 3, the Fresh Energy collaboration and coalition model becomes a national model. And with that, I think we're ready to dive into Decade 3. Let's start with equity. Not only did Fresh Energy start integrating equity into the organization's work, but we also formed a new program area called Energy Access and Equity. Michael, can you tell us how these conversations began?
Of course I can, Joe. I really can't talk about our commitment to equity without acknowledging a coworker, colleague, and mentor of mine, Shantara Hardy. We originally hired, I think we recruited Shantara out of Health Partners, where she was a lobbyist on healthcare, but she had a background in transportation planning and urban planning and reducing dependence on automotive, reliance on automobiles for families. And she became our director of transportation in the built environment. But she also helped us realize that we would never have the breadth and strength and power that could really transform society unless we address the fact that transforming our energy economy might have equity impacts or distributional impacts or fairness impacts. I mean, we always knew that, people who have the least resources and lowest incomes, have to be protected from cost but we never really had previously incorporated that a lot of people in America got left behind in the Industrial Revolution, and we wanted to have a technological revolution that was strong enough to lift everybody up. And Shantara ultimately became the Commissioner of Employment and Economic Development in the Dayton administration. She was able to pursue that vision at the highest level of public policy. But we formed an energy access and equity team after that. We picked Ben Passer, a young attorney on our staff, to lead, who carried the mantle that Shantara helped us get going. And he really took that whole program up a level. And now it's one of the 5 pillars of Fresh Energy's imperatives, that everything we do across every aspect of public policy, everything we work on, has to go through a lens of answering the question, is this making inequality better, or is this making inequality worse? And we will only want to work on solutions that reduce inequality. So I'm super proud of the commitment we've made. And obviously with the racial reckoning and the uprising in the streets that happened after George Floyd's murder at 38th in Chicago, I didn't realize that a nonprofit climate and energy leader had to be a civil rights leader until that moment. But I felt really well positioned to have Fresh Energy help deeply commit that our energy transformation would reduce the injustice, inequality, and the really horrendous disparities between the races, especially here in Minnesota, where the disparities are among the worst of any state in the country.
Thank you, Michael. And today, just for some additional context, Fresh Energy is on its 2nd iteration of our energy access and equity work, with a team focused on reducing the energy burden for under-resourced households, cutting the carbon, health, and financial cost of transportation, partnering with local governments on equitable climate action goals, and more. So that work is only expanding as we enter into the next decade. But another major moment for Fresh Energy in the third decade was when, as an organization, we started really focusing on regulatory work at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, also known as the PUC. So prior to this, we'd emphasized legislative work, which is another really important place that policies are made. But in the past decade, the regulatory work became equally important for the organization. And Jim, I think you saw that shift firsthand.
I did see that, and I think others in the coalition early on saw that. And so one of the action items we took even before we were incorporated was to get involved in a PUC proceeding that involved what was then called Northern States Power. This was before the merger of that resulted in Xcel Energy. And we were underfunded and understaffed and lacked a little talent, but we fought the good fight. And I think it was a good first effort, and certainly one that has continued at Fresh Energy and built upon. And it was just, there have been a lot of dockets over the years that Fresh Energy has entered and has a great team doing it now.
So, Michael, has it been a strategic choice to ramp up the regulatory work in that time?
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we worked closely with nonprofit law firms who helped represent us in front of the Public Utilities Commission throughout the 90s and the 2000s. Specifically want to mention Environmental Law and Policy Center of the Midwest out of Chicago, represented us in some really important landmark cases that made really big difference. And the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is a longtime, both legal representation and partner currently. But around 2014, we made the decision that we really had to deepen our bench on regulatory chops, because these utilities, that are headquartered here in Minnesota, they get their approval of their revenues, and they get the approval of their plans, and they get their approval of what resources are going to be built by the Public Utilities Commission. So a young woman who we hired out of the Department of Commerce named Holly Ladd really was the initial commitment to up our game. She then became Director of Renewable Energy at Target, and then subsequently now is leading renewable energy or influentially impacting renewable energy decisions at Facebook. But Alan Gleckner is the guy who took it up a level. We love to celebrate Alan Gleckner's victory, but I'll just, as humbly as I can be, I'll say that Director of Clean Energy, Lead Director of Clean Energy at Fresh Energy, Alan Gleckner, is one of the most important voices at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. And I not only hear that from advocates, I hear it from the power company, and I hear it from the regulators, that we do a good job of trying to figure out how to bring people together and get the evidence in front of the decision makers so they can make decisions in the public interest. And I'm very, very, very proud of that work.
Well, I don't know that Alan has a ton of time to listen to podcasts, but maybe his ears are burning right now. Maybe we'll tell him to listen to this podcast at a certain timestamp so he gets the official shout out. So another moment in Fresh Energy's history, and in fact in the United States history, that I want to make sure we don't miss is by our third decade, climate had become a critical national and global issue. Jay, what did you see as the voice of Minnesota on the federal and global stage, and how did you seize on these opportunities?
I had been working on the federal Clean Power Plan for several years before the U.S. plan was released in August 2015. I was thrilled and honored to be invited by President Obama to meet with him in the White House for an hour, with just 12 invited guests from states like those of the Heartland. 2 of us were Minnesotans. Other than me, it was the CEO of Xcel Energy, Ben Folk, in the room too. After an hour with the president, we walked together into the East Room where the Obama administration talked to the international media and 300 VIPs about the facets of his clean power plan. That is one that would have cut carbon pollution from coal plants. And in 2005, I was invited to my first International Climate Change Summit held in Montreal. There, I got invited to have dinner with the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada. So I knew I had some kind of power. I liked that access and intended to build on it. I have now represented Fresh Energy at 6 global climate summits. Every time I get invited to meet with the head of the US delegation's negotiating team. I have an hour with them and with no more than 10 other Americans, and we listen to each other's action priorities. Every year, I have led a set of Minnesotans to create at least 1 or 2 public presentations to the global audiences, showcasing our push so far on decarbonizing the Midwest. We emphasize the utter importance of transforming our region on the way to decarbonizing the world.
Thank you, Jay. And Michael, by 2013, climate had actually become a partisan issue. Given all of your bipartisan work in the 90s and early 2000s by you and by Fresh Energy, it must have been a real shock to see leaders and legislators who had once been Fresh Energy's allies on policies like the Next Generation Energy Act completely turn on the issue.
Yeah, that is one of the saddest parts of my career, that, a broadly bipartisan issue got partisan. And, I know exactly who to blame. The blame goes to the oil industry in general and the Koch family in Wichita, Kansas in particular. People don't know this, but, when you think of all the funding of the 2 major political parties, the Democratic Party in America and the Republican Party in America, the Koch network funding is about equivalent to each of the 2 parties. And they were singularly focused. Well, they maybe had additional emphases, but one of their singular focuses was to make climate change impossible for Republican legislators to support. And that's been well documented in many books, and Dark Money by Jane Meyer is the seminal book on the subject. But there's nothing I could have ever done to prevent that. But when you have like American Petroleum Institute and Exxon and Koch putting hundreds of millions of dollars into dozens of organizations their job is not to convince Americans that global warming is baloney. Their job is to convince Americans that global warming is uncertain and no one knows for sure. So the product was doubt. Product is doubt. Naomi Reska is a historian at Harvard, wrote a powerful book, Merchants of Doubt is the name of the book, and chapter and verse that they copied from the tobacco industry, every tactic, and they succeeded in having. So you can go to Brussels, Belgium, or Amsterdam, or Beijing, or Kinshasa, in Africa, and every person on the street will know, like, global warming, that's really a serious problem. But you go to Des Moines and people say, well, on one hand, some people say it is. On the other hand, people say maybe it isn't. And that is a testament to the dark money of the oil industry. So you got to say it out loud as to why we're in the predicament we are. But we continue to work every day to find allies on both sides of the aisle. And we're exclusively a nonpartisan organization. We never engage in elections or electoral politics. We want to work with everybody and bring everybody together like we did in 2007. I might give a shout out to Attorney General Keith Ellison, who decided at Fresh Energy's urging to sue Exxon, Koch brothers, and the American Petroleum Institute, not for the global warming damages they did to Minnesota, but for their false advertising and deceit that basically using our consumer protection and false advertising laws. Keith Ellison is in court right now suing those companies for false advertising.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for noting that. So for those taking notes at home, 3 of the pivotal moments for Fresh Energy in the 3rd decade are: number 1, equity began playing a key role in Fresh Energy's work. Number 2, Fresh Energy began working even more in the regulatory space at the Public Utilities Commission. And 3, climate change became both an existential issue for the globe and a Minnesota and U.S. partisan issue. Well, I appreciate our listeners tuning in to this kind of time machine conversation that we've had today. But I'm especially grateful for the 3 of you for joining me on this whirlwind tour of the pivotal moments of the past 3 decades of Fresh Energy. So I think we've created a bit of an audio time capsule here together. But before we close, I want to open up the floor for any parting thoughts. Jay, Jim, Michael?
I love it, Joe, that you call this Crossroads. Fresh Energy is very concerned about climate change, and we see it as a solvable crisis. We have approached it with making it a local issue and also one that has its fastest roots of solutions deep in the energy sector. First, Fresh Energy for 30 years has been focused on efficiencies of all kinds, including energy efficiency, of the importance of affordability of energy, especially to those neighborhoods that are the homes of under-resourced communities. We need vibrant economies that are all equitable, carbon neutral economies. We believe in shaping and driving bold policy solutions, and we need to ensure reliable and affordable energy during this time of not a transition, because we're in a transformation in how we power our lives. It was crucial to communicate about climate change as doing harm to the people who are most damaged by inequity in our society. And climate damages people now in damage due to floods and droughts, excessive weather, and health needs, including from winds, storms, wildfires, invasive species, and heat waves. We are paying for it in higher insurance rates, even things that can no longer be insured. And remember, it is not about polar bears alone. It is a crisis for humanity. Now, 26% of the US's greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by the Midwest. If our Midwest region were a country, we would rank as the 5th top carbon emitter in the world, in between Russia and Japan. The lesson is that energy for 50 years or more in the middle and late 1900s was seen as a boring, reliable, but moribund industry. People didn't yet know of affordable, reliable technologies that could replace fossil fuels. So it is no wonder that I used to, when I tripped all around Minnesota speaking, I used to regularly meet people who didn't know how their electricity was generated, no matter who was selling it, and they had no idea what it costs. This has all now changed with the dominant electricity sources that have risen to the forefront as the cheapest and cleanest are all renewables. First, wind, and second, solar. But our barrier in much of our 30 years was getting people very interested in shaping our new, utterly transformed, carbon neutral energy sector and growing interest in electrifying everything we can in our economy. Now, we are several years into the most decisive decade in human history, and it ends in 2030. And we must decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030.
Thank you, Jay. Jim, any closing thoughts for us?
What I really found some paperwork from the early days, and what struck me is how prescient, how on the mark Fresh Energy and the coalition and those involved in those early days were, in terms of the thoughts and the actions that they picked out. And I think that foundation enabled things to grow, bring people aboard like Jay, and hire Michael as the executive director, and then the team we have today now at Fresh Energy doing so many different remarkable things. Unfortunately, many of the things that we observed in the early 1990s still are challenges, as Jay just explained. And yet there is hope with the people that we have on the team at Fresh Energy and the outreach that the group is making to others around the state, certainly in the Midwest and in the nation. So we just realize there's so much to be done, and let's keep at it.
Thanks, Jim. Michael, as the fearless leader, final thoughts?
People sometimes ask me, how do you keep your confidence up? How do you keep your morale up when this challenge to humanity is existential? Isn't it a little heavy to work on climate change every day? And of course, the answer is yes, if you actually understand the science and the risk and the math. Bill McKibben likes to say that, physics actually doesn't negotiate. Physics is physics. But the plain physics of the matter is that we do have to reduce our emissions by about half this decade, and then we have to reduce them down to net zero by about the middle of the century. And of course, I'd like to do it a little faster than that, and maybe some people dragging their feet like to do it slower. But what gives me hope are the impatient young people who are demanding change, whether it's Greta Thunberg or Sunrise Movement or our own local climate generation. People demanding change these people are our children. And what's different today than when we started is that we can see a clear pathway how our electric system can be without carbon. It's absolutely obvious how to get to 85-90% carbon free, and the last 10 to 15% is going to require some head scratching and innovation and technological improvements. We could see how we can have cars that don't run on fossil fuel and couple that with transit and biking and walking and better designed neighborhoods. We can see how to do that. And we can now see how buildings and industrial emissions can be tackled with innovation. So here we are at the tipping point of human history where things could get really, really dark. But the tipping point of technology and politics is bright. And so I am really, really optimistic. And Jay didn't say this, so she said it 1,000 times, and I'm going to steal it from her, that when our children ask us, when the science was so clear, what did you do? We'll say we did everything we could, and it worked. We made the difference.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Well, I really appreciated this conversation, and I appreciate the three of you for being here and everyone for listening. And for our listeners, I want to invite you to get more involved with Fresh Energy. Join us for an in-person or virtual event this month. There are a whole bunch. Speak up for clean energy and participate in an action alert on our website, or make a donation today. You can do all of those things and more, and keep up on the latest and greatest clean energy news at our website, fresh-energy.org. And in the upper right corner, you'll see buttons for taking action, events, and making a donation. So it's all there in one spot. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.